Hello friends, welcome to my channel. My name is Lisa and this is my little channel on YouTube where I share my creative pursuits with fiber and yarn mainly and other artistic pursuits that strike my fancy. If you're a returning viewer, thank you so much for continuing to come back and spend time with me. This has been a weekly vlog for the past half a dozen weeks or so. I film on a Friday, I edit on Saturday, and I usually get the video up Saturday afternoon. So thank you so much for all your kind feedback and constructive criticism. I appreciate each and every one of you, and thank you again for coming back. So I believe this is week 10 of my breed study. So I've created my own winter breed study from a box of fibers that I picked up from Hearthside Fibers right before Christmas. I think we're down to our last. I think I have a baker's dozen. I have 13, and I think I'm on 10 now. Today we're going to talk about Falkland wool or Falklands wool, which really isn't a breed. It's a fiber that comes from a certain location. It's actually a mixed breed. And then next week we're going to talk about Rambouillet and then Polworth and then Merino. I think that's the order that I have scheduled. So yeah, thank you so much for continuing to come back. Every week I spin a 25 gramish sample on my spindles. I ply it into a 2-ply sportish weight and I knit a square. So up till now I've been knitting the Berlin blanket by Kate Davies. It's a modular blanket that's knit in the round, and it has a real cute little leaf motif. Well, this week I went off schedule and I picked a different stitch pattern for my swatch, which I'll share with you here. And that also ties in with my from my bookshelves segment this week. I'm going to talk about Barbara Walker's first 2 treasury of knitting patterns and the one that I picked for my spin this week. So yeah, so let's talk about Falkland wool. So I found a couple of articles online. One of them was from woolgatherings.com. And I got a lot of information about the breed there. And then I also gleaned some information about the islands and a little bit more about the wool from Northwest Yarns, I think. I think that's an online distributor of fiber and yarn. So Falkland wool is grown on the Falkland Islands, which are a group of 776 islands, 300 miles off southeast coast of South America. And it's a combination of Polworth, Merino, Corriedale, and Romney sheep. So initially the first sheep that were brought to the Falkland Islands were Cheviots, and then later on they brought in other breeds, so Romney, Corriedale, Merino. Wool micron is widely varied. It's 18 to 33, but most of the wool is between 27 and 30 microns, so it's kind of in the upper medium. Staple length is 3 to 4 inches. I think my fiber here was more like 5 inches, I think. Yeah, I've got my little sample here. And my yarn, my sample really felt a lot like a Romney or an old style Corriedale. It had a very a wave to the wool rather than a crimpy structure. And it spun up and knit up very much like Romney, in my opinion. So I read that when you get Falkland wool and you want to do a large spin, you should get it all at the same time from the same source, because the Falkland wool can be widely varied. For example, John Arbin in Devon, they have all their merino is Falklands merino. So in the Falkland Islands, they do breed purebred merino sheep. And so I read that there are lots of different farmers on the islands, and they all breed their wool, and then they put them in wool pools generally, and then it goes to the best price. But there is on the website, there's a page, there's a really nice website, I think it's called falklandwool.uk, which I will link. Everything I talk about I'll link in the down bar. But there was one page about like the finest micron competition, and there were a list of different farmers, shepherds, and what their micron was, what their finest micron was. So I think that there are farmers there breeding for very fine fleeces, and then some of the fleeces are more medium. So here's my sample, and that's it. So it's pulling it apart the best I can. So yeah, I measured it on my ruler, and it's about 5 inches. And it had a wave. It really did remind me of a commercially prepared Corriedale or Romney. So it wasn't very crimpy. The fiber is reported to be excellent for spinning and felting, exceptionally bright white. I didn't find the yarn to be particular. I mean, it is very white. It's sort of the creamy white color you get from white fleeces, but it was certainly not as white as this Corriedale this is a Corriedale Angora blend that I carded up that I'm spinning. But they breed only for white wool. White wool is the commercially valuable. I just found I found the wool to be of a slightly generic quality. I tend to go for breed-specific fiber, and I mean, it was sort of a slog this week for me to get through my sample. I was very uninspired, and I'm not dissing the wool at all. It's a very useful, sturdy wool. I'm sure it comes in very fine categories, and I guess it takes dye beautifully. I think I hand spun enough for a hat, and it was just sort of a everyday, all around, all-purpose, nice wool. So Cheviots were introduced to the islands in 1851, and sheep are so important to the economy of the Falkland Islands that there's a sheep on the flag. The island was used historically to resupply ships, and more recently there's been a boost in tourism. There's only about 3,500 people on the islands and 500,000 sheep. So that makes 1 person per square mile, 1 person per 140 sheep, and 1 person per 300 penguins, because the Falkland Islands are a haven for penguins as well. There's many different breeds that live there, which I thought was really cute. You can find pictures online of the penguins and the sheep, in the same picture, which I think is really cute. The white wool production has been a constant for 150 years. However, flocks were depleted in 1982 during the Falklands War. So there was a undeclared war. Argentina was claiming the Falkland Islands because it's in their waters, actually, And so the UK went in, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister at the time, and there was I forget how many weeks, it was just a several weeks long war, but it was reported that many of the sheep were killed by Argentinian soldiers for food. There was also a lot of mines that were laid by the Argentine soldiers so that, the British would, were stymied in their, invasion. And as a matter of fact, it was just in 2020 that the last of the mines were removed. So some of the mines were on this beach. I think the beach was called York Bay. Yeah, York Bay. And York Bay provided a de facto nature habitat for penguins. And so there was some controversy about removing the mines on that particular area because the little penguins weren't heavy enough to blow the mines. And they said also the mines might have gotten swept on the dunes under the sand. So there was some pushback. A lot of the people that lived there didn't want those mines removed because they didn't want the habitat disturbed. But there was a treaty, I think it's the Ottawa Convention required the removal of mines. So they started in 2009 and they finished in 2020. So I guess the penguin population is alive and well there in the Falklands. So I thought that was very interesting. So after the war, the formerly Cheviot and mixed breed flocks were supplemented by livestock donations from the UK and I think New Zealand and Australia. And so with populations of Corrie, Romney, and later Australian Merino and Polworth. So yeah, I think I might get my hands on some wool that says Falkland Merino and compare it to my spin and see how they compare. A great effort was placed into research and development for optimal genetics and farming practices. The wool is grown by a network of family farms that pool their wool together. It's called the Falkland Islands Wool Company. Sheep are outdoors 100% of the time, and the weather is very inhospitable to sheep parasites. So parasites are almost non-existent on the sheep there. So the dipping and drenching is not necessary for the sheep there. And so most of the wool meets organic standards. So I've read that as a marketing note on product, that it meets organic standards. It's a very pristine environment. There's not a lot of industry. It's mainly tourism and sheep herding. I mean, there's just like loads and loads of sheep. So R.H. Lindsay Wool Company is a website that sells fiber in bulk, and they said the predominant wool is Corriedale. And that sort of rings true to my spin. This really felt like, really felt like a Corriedale to me. Not the super fine Corriedales, but more of the, medium Corries. Yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. Again, every time you study a sheep breed, you study a certain location and you study some history. So yeah, so from the Northwest Yarns website, they said that the UK governed since 1833, and the majority of the people that live on the islands want the UK citizenship. I think they did a referendum, and over 90%. What else about Falkland? Yeah, I think that's about it. There was the 10-week war in 1982, which is sort of a turning point, and a lot of the sheep were killed, and then new sheep were brought in, and it's an ongoing enterprise. So I would think that a lot of the 100% wool that you would get in a lot of places that's not labeled as breed specific might come from the Falklands. So yeah, many of the immigrants were from England, France, Scandinavian, Scotland, and Wales. So, a huge wool tradition there as well. So wool is gathered. Yeah, I talked about the pools, and then the sheep and the penguins living, coexisting. Yeah, my geography is woefully terrible. I don't even, where things are located. So yeah, in this whole breed study, I'm learning more about geography, and yeah, it's just been really interesting. All right, so let me talk to you about my spin. I spun the wool short forward draw. I'm going to stand up here and show you what I have left. I have quite a bit left, despite the fact that I had a little plying accident. I was trying to ply from the inside and the outside, and I hadn't let the singles rest, and I got a big mess here. So here's my wool. And it just reminds me of a Romney. It even has a little bit of a halo. Despite the worsted spin, it does feel pretty light. And this is my swatch. So I decided to take a pattern out of Barbara Walker's Second Treasury of Knitting Patterns, because yesterday was Thursday, and I started my Berlin blanket, and each square of the Berlin blanket starts with a pinhole cast on. You cast on 8 stitches with a crochet hook, and then you have to finagle them around 4 needles. I've been using double points, and despite the fact that I've made 10 of these already, I couldn't get it started. I kept making mistakes. After the 3rd try, I looked at my husband across the room and I said, honey, I don't know if I can do this. Should I just forget this week? And he said, oh no, honey, what you should do is just knit something else. I'm like, well yeah, that's an idea. And so, yeah, this is the swatch. So can you see? Can you see the 2-ply actually would be quite nice for lace, though I'd probably spin it a little bit thinner if I was going to do a lace shawl. But there is, I don't know if you're seeing this, there is a slight halo. So yeah, so I don't know how this is going to fit in with my whole blanket, but I think I was getting kind of bored with that pattern, and the cast on was just so fiddly this time. I don't know why. I don't think I plied enough, and so the plies kept on plying, and so we'll see what I can do with all these squares. They're all about 6 by 6 inches, and so I figure if I block them all to about the same size and maybe do a little crochet finagling around the edges, I might be able to put them all together into a blanket. So yes, so what pattern did I use? I used a pattern out of this book, which ties right into from my bookshelf this week. And I used this pattern called the Flower Eyelet pattern. And it was actually kind of fun. I just cast on 40 stitches, and then this happened to be a multiple of 8 plus 4. So I just used this as and it was actually quite satisfying knitting the swatch to match the picture in the book. It's kind of cool. So this is my selection from my bookshelf. There are actually 2 books. This one is the first one. It was published in 1968, Treasury of Knitting Patterns. There are 4 altogether. They're published by Schoolhouse Press, which was started by Elizabeth Zimmerman and her daughter. So there's actually 4. Yeah, there's a Treasury of Knitting Patterns 1968, which is this blue one. And then the second one came out in 1970. They're not charted, though the pictures, the swatches kind of provides a chart, I found, but I do prefer, if it's a lace pattern, to work from a chart, but I know a lot of people don't. Then there was charted knitting designs in 1972, and then a 4th Treasury of Knitting Patterns in 2001. I only have the first 2 books. I think I bought these when I first became a knitter. I learned how to knit with the help of Lucy Neatby's DVD series on Learn to Knit. At that time, there wasn't all the YouTube University videos available, and I still have those CDs, and they were amazing. And I always credit Lucy Neatby with making me a knitter. But in her DVDs, in her lessons, she does talk about getting a book of patterns, though she does recommend charts. So you may know these books. I'd be curious to know how many of you have this book in your on your bookshelf. It has 100. I don't know how many. It's I think she said 500. There's 550 patterns in this book. So let me show you the table of contents here. I just reread the introduction this morning, and there's some interesting passages in there that I want to share with you today. We've got simple knit purl combinations. So that's chapter 2. Then she's got a whole section on ribbings, color change patterns, slip stitch patterns, twisted stitch patterns, fancy texture. I love that fancy texture patterns. Patterns made with yarn overs, eyelet patterns, lace and cables. Cable stitch patterns. So this is the first book. And Barbara Walter is sort of that old school create your own garment, swatch and practice, make the swatches. And she's a big proponent of taking a, what would be a plain stockinette sweater, which she says, oh, a machine could make that, and making it personal, making it yours, adding a cable panel, adding a panel of lace, doing something fancy around the edges. And her whole philosophy here is to empower the knitter to not just go by a pattern, but to create their own patterns, which I think is really cool and kind of goes against kind of the trend now, which is, buy every pattern that comes out. And a lot of the patterns are almost the same. They're stockinette, and maybe they're knit with a different yarn, but basically it's the same, top down, short rows, etc. So I thought that was very interesting. I mean, I'm a pattern follower myself, so I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying that I aspire to create my own designs that fit me, right? Yeah, so in the introduction, she talks about creating things and the history of knitting, but she says something here that really resonated with me today, and it was that there is something in every human soul which seeks to create a thing of beauty, given any sort of opportunity and materials to do so. Throughout all the ages, people have pursued their own ideas of beauty, building, shaping, weaving, painting, decorating. They have carried on that pursuit through every medium that ever came to hand: wood, stone, feathers, bone, ivory, cloth, jewels, metal, clay, leather, pigment, and yarn. Knitting is very much a part of that age-old pursuit of the beautiful. Many patterns known today were first formed by hands that have become dust hundreds or even thousands of years ago, but the same patterns may still be formed by other hands. Thus, knitting is a true folk art in that it has been developed over the course of centuries by millions of ordinary people whose delight it was to create beauty with their own hands. Yeah. So she speaks to the novice knitter and encourages the novice knitter to dive in and try some of the simpler patterns and not just read, but actually do, which, is sort of a universal advice for anything, actually do. She's a big proponent of test swatches, of course. And one of the things she said, in working without a garment pattern, the test swatch is even more important. Though you may not believe it in the beginning, it is surprisingly easy to design your own garments to your own measurements. Every knitter should have a sample box of patterns that have been learned to serve for future reference. So that reminded me of Ivana's channel, The Republic of Me. She has a series of, she calls them models, that she's made for her and her sister, her auntie, and she has this basically has worked out the numbers and creates her garments without a pattern. And I think that's really a wonderful skill to have. So in her second book, she continues with the same sort of contents, but she has a lot more different types of patterns. She has a lot more slip stitch patterns, mosaic patterns. So a lot of the Andrea Mowry pieces. Does Stephen West do slip stitches? Yeah. So that these designers that are clever enough to put together these patterns are using these stitch dictionaries and probably swatching and getting inspiration from these books. So pretty much the same table of contents, it's just that she's got new patterns in here and just loads and loads of them. And she gives them, if there's a historical name, she gives it that name, or she's created her own name. But one of the things that she talks about in this book is that stockinette is a canvas. And yes, this was in the second one, this is the one she mentioned, that all over plain stockinette stitch is dull to look at and boring to work, even for the beginner. Though it may be done entirely by hand, it lacks the inimitable flavor of hand knitting. A machine can make it very nicely, but the hand knitter is not a machine and should not try to imitate one. Opinionated, I think. I mean, sometimes you just want something plain knitting for other reasons, maybe. But she says the beginner should learn to use some of the stitch patterns right away, that you get mastery over knitting by doing so. And, just to take a simple garment and add a little bit of unique, something that makes it just unique to you. Yeah, she talks a little bit about gauge and modifying the pattern. She encourages you to try it out, to knit creatively. Remember, you are a hand knitter with a brain, and no knitting machine can ever imitate. And then I think I'll close here with a couple of sentences from the end of the introduction that really spoke to my heart this morning as I read, and I think it might for you as well. Handicrafts of all kind hold a deep, unspoken philosophy, which contributes to the satisfaction of their practitioners. Thousands of years of history have passed over human civilization, and during all that time, human beings have fought, killed, plundered, and wronged each other in every possible way. Of such stuff history is made. But also during all that time, other human beings have quietly and patiently persevered in the development of arts, crafts, inventions, and ideas. From these millions of creative workers, most of them unnoticed and unknown in the upheavals of history, have come the good and lasting things in the sum total of human culture. The builders, the weavers, the artisans, the carvers, the smiths, the poets and musicians, the inventors of new techniques in all fields, these were and are the makers of civilization. The eternal calm figure of the needleworker looms large among them, for the arts of thread and yarn have been with us since the beginning. When you embroider, crochet, or knit, and I added spin, there are centuries in your hands. You are a maker, doing the same thing that others have done for several thousand years. Their ideas created the techniques you now use. Who knows what pair of hands that first cabled some stitches across some other stitches? Who knows where and when the first yarn over strand was put on a needle to make an opening? All that matters is that these things were done somewhere by someone. Now they are part of our very ancient craft called knitting. And then she talks about the 20th century. This was published in the 20th century. And that in today's fast-paced culture, so it's even more fast-paced now, the labor of the needle seems more attractive to more people because it is now a luxury rather than necessity. For luxuries always outshine their poor plain sisters, the necessities. For any and all of these reasons, the fact remains that the age-old pleasures of knitting are being enthusiastically rediscovered all over the civilized world. The modern discoveries are not all women either. So she talks about men. Of course, men knit. Men knitted. Women spun and men knitted, when in the guilds. Anyone who loves knitting or any other form of needlework should feel glad to be alive in this time, which rivals or even surpasses previous great periods of creativity. Use these patterns to refine and embellish your own ideas, and you become one of the makers of the world. Your hands, too, can hold and transmit the legacy of one of civilization's most beloved arts. So a lot of that resonated with me, not just the knitting, but also the spinning, which is having a huge resurgence right now. And I hope that if you're a new spinner, that you stick with some of the frustration of learning. When you're first learning how to spin, you're usually not very good at it, and it takes a lot of time and practice and concerted effort to become proficient and to become really good at something. And so, being an adult and being a new learner is sometimes frustrating because we often feel like, oh, we're adults, we should be able to do this right away. So, yes, please be patient with yourself if you're a new spinner, and I hope you are enjoying your spinning journey. So last week I showed you this Zauberball Crazy, and I do have a sock that's underway. I love the colors. I think the name of this colorway is Hourglass. I'm going to knit the leg 7 inches, and so I'm almost ready to do the heel. I'm using Ellie from Craft House Magic has a free pattern for socks on Ravelry, and she also has a series of videos on her YouTube channel where she tells you how to knit a sock, which I thought was really, really kind and generous of people to do, just put that content out there for free. So that's what I've been working on there. I've been plugging away with my knitting belt. Talk about frustration and being a new learner. Because when you use a knitting belt, that one needle is stationary, I have to learn to change my knitting style a bit. And it's sometimes after I've been using the belt for about a half an hour, I'll notice my shoulders really, really tight and everything, because I think, I'm learning it and I'm just concentrating so hard. But I'm sticking with it. I do think it's going to pay off in the end. Let me show you what it looks like here. So this is a Chatham wrap. I talked about this last week. I haven't gotten too much further along, but I'm bound and determined to knit the whole thing with these long double-pointed needles and my knitting belt. And I will try to get some video of me knitting on this, though it's not really very impressive, I have to say. And then I went into my hand-spun stash. If you've been with me for a while, you may remember this spin. This yarn here is a sweater quantity of CVM that I spun up woolen on my Lendrum. I have more than enough for a sweater. I have 4 huge hanks of the dark chocolatey brown, almost black, and then I have 1 skein of gray, and this is also CVM. And I'm going to knit the, oh my goodness, Arboreal Jumper by Jennifer Steingass. And I think this afternoon I'm going to go ahead and wind this up and do a swatch, because I don't want to start, I'm going to take Barbara Walker's advice and do a test swatch, because that's important, right? So I've got that on the go. And then I was craving some fiber preparation. And so this basket here, this is Finn wool. This is a Finn lamb's wool. Here's a little skein that I worsted spun from Comb Nest from that. And then this here is my was my newer fleece, my Liana, the Finn. And I'm making these little nests. And if I have time here, I've got my little tiny mini combs set up here. I thought we would close today with me doing some combing, a little bit of fiber prep. Yeah, so what kind of spindles do I have in here? I have, this one is one of my Vermont spindles. It's a beautiful spinner. I think it's Cocobolo. This spindle here is a green sleeve spindle. And then this is a spindle from a friend of mine who is experimenting with making spindles. And isn't it beautiful? I think it's like a dyed maple burl. It's really, really beautiful. And a very nice spinner too. So working on that. So I think I'll close here today with a little bit of combing. I've got my little comb set up here on a table. I thought you might enjoy watching a little bit of fiber prep. I'm combing this fin wool and just making these tiny little nests. And I'm not doing a really fancy combing where you comb and you comb multiple times. I'm just doing 2 or 3 passes, and that seems to be making quite a nice preparation for spinning, because it's so soft. Yeah, this is the kind of wool that speaks to my heart. I mean, I know where it came from. It came from a lamb, that lives in Massachusetts. This over something that's from a wool pool. I mean, this is going to win any day of the week, right? Yeah, so I'll go ahead and switch the camera angle here, do a little bit of combing, and then I do hope you have a lovely week. I hope you're safe and warm wherever you are, and you're finding a lot of time for crafty pursuits. All right, friends, next week we'll see you again. I think the breed is Polworth, and I can't wait to get that spin underway, and we'll see you real soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.